Hey, welcome to the first Bracketville podcast. I am Tim Kruger, along with me, the owner, operator, legend, Dave Ullman. Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, Tim. How are you today?
I'm
I'll
feeling a
take
little
all of
better
that. I
today.
don't know that I'm a legend, though.
Well, yeah, you are. You're a legend. You're a legend circles. Whenever I bring up your name amongst media people, I was like, oh yeah, Dave, yeah, I follow him. Yeah. So today we thought we're going to do these periodically throughout the season. We'll probably try and ramp it up as we get closer towards Selection Sunday. I'm sure that championship week we can do a couple of them as things evolve and change and so forth. And you guys have a lot of questions. Um, Feel free when you're watching on this YouTube, if you're watching on our YouTube channel, feel free to go down. We'll put a link in Bracketville. You'll go there, watch it, and at the bottom there'll be a chat feature. If you have any questions, just put them into chat down there or onto our Twitter, two different Twitter accounts. You can do that as well. And then we will answer them as we go along. We can answer them on the next podcast, however you want to do it, but we'll be glad to do that. So today we're just going to cover a few topics and keep this fairly short. First thing I want to mention is I'm sure you've seen, if you've been to our site, you've seen the BB rankings. Another new one came out today and wrote a little piece on that. And I wonder what Dave's thoughts are on it. That it's always very interesting to me to see who's going to be at the top. Although this is one of the strange years where you don't even need to do it. You can just put Auburn at the top of everything, right? They're just absolutely dominant. Um, but I also find it interesting as I rank them all out in the rankings that they get ranked. I find it interesting to look at some teams that I'm like, wow, everybody has a lot bigger opinion of this team. Now, granted, as we said, it's a result-based metric, but still, they fit fairly low in the rankings. Now, one of those teams that jumped out at me this week was Gonzaga. I think they're all the way down to 38 in our top 50. Now, until last week, most people had Gonzaga in that for 5, 6, 7 range, 8 range maybe. But according to that, they would be like a 10 seed, which they're probably dropping closer to now. But it does kind of jump out at you that they haven't, the BB rankings really measures high quality wins, especially on the road, tier 1A, so forth, and you get more points for those than you do, say, a 2B. And it does really point out that they really don't have much on the rankings. And now, when you throw on a bad loss, which Santa Clara is, it's a Q3 loss, even though it's really not a bad loss per se because it's a 75, but in our system it falls into a bad loss category. It even lessens their score more. What do you think about the Bulldogs?
Well, yeah, I think, it's one of those things where the net obviously still, maybe not as much as they did a week ago, are still pretty high on the Zags. Um,
Yeah,
but
let
results
me
this
pull
year,
up
they just really haven't,
their team sheet here for
typically
us.
what we see from Gonzaga this time of year, Tim, is that they play an incredibly strong non-conference schedule. And they are able to ride some of those victories, which they often get early in the year, throughout the season. And
And
with their,
there's Gonzaga's
generally
team sheet for
speaking,
everybody.
that their with their predictive metrics being almost always very good under Mark Few, it has enabled the Zags over the years to routinely get those top 3 to 4 seeds. What you'll see if you look at the team sheet this year, the biggest difference is their non-conference schedule, highlighted there with all the blue, was still really strong. But that overtime loss to Kentucky, the overtime loss to West Virginia, in the Bahamas, and really, if you take away, they had that Baylor game to start the year and just blew the doors off of Baylor. And we thought, here we go again with another Gonzaga team that's probably going to be a number one seed in March. Since then, other than a win at San Diego State and that win against Indiana in the Bahamas, they just really haven't had that same kind of up that you would see. And so a loss, like you mentioned, to Santa Clara is going to, while not bad per se, is going to be a little more detrimental maybe to their final seed because, their resume metrics are just going to be lower than they usually are.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they don't have those high quality wins. And you mentioned 2 wins off the bat. First thing that jumped out at me, those are back in November. So I think the overall impression is, man, they're fading. And I always thought too, going into the season, the Gonzagas and St. Mary's of the world were going to have it much tougher because Washington State and Oregon State, no matter how they fit into the Pac-12 realm of things, are going to be a better opponent than they normally play. And after time, and sure you can say, well, they should be better than those teams. I granted, but the more you play those teams that are right on the edge, in the past, San Francisco's been a team that's been right there. Santa Clara has been there well. You start playing more and more of those teams, and eventually you're gonna have a team rise up and beat you, especially on the road, like Oregon State did. And it's very strange to see Gonzaga 2 games in a row, at least 2 games in a row in conference.
Yeah, and again, I think your point's well made, Tim, that while Oregon State and Washington State, and we're just throwing them in because they're, new participants to the West Coast Conference, um, aren't necessarily going to end up being tournament teams this year. They're certainly much stronger opponents than traditionally, anyway, coming from the former Pac-12 than what you're going to get night in and night out with Loyola Marymount, Pepperdine, teams like that. Just even having to go on the road to those
Yeah,
gyms are going to be bigger gyms. The fan bases are going to be bigger. The gyms are going to be louder. Maybe they're not as close, but it's bigger arenas. And just the depth of talent that's going to be on those rosters is going to be a little bit stronger night in and night out. So yes, I guess the good news for Gonzaga is that as they go through the remainder of this season, that's also going to give them more quad two opportunities and maybe some quad one opportunities that they might otherwise not get.
right,
And at the
right.
same time, I think, much like most years, you can say this for either school, but how Gonzaga fares against St. Mary's and vice versa is going to end up probably being big for both those schools, at least potentially in terms of where they might end up being seated. And for St. Mary's, just, those top 20, 25 net that they're going to get from Gonzaga could be a huge boost to their resume as to even making it in.
Yeah, and you look at Oregon, they're 60th, so that's a Q1B loss for Gonzaga, so that's not bad at all. In fact, you mentioned about teams, Oregon State, Washington State, just as a throw in here. I personally would have had Oregon State onto my consideration line had they not lost this weekend.
Yeah, they were, I think, this was last week, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head here, but I think they were in at the bottom of my next, that next group in line after beating Gonzaga. And then again, they dropped a game this past weekend to fall back a little bit. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting. What I do think, though, at least as we sit here today recording this, there's much greater likelihood that we're going to see Gonzaga more towards the middle of the bracket come March than we are in the upper protected seat area,
Oh, absolutely.
unless you know they basically finish out the season and end up somewhere with only, I don't want to say keeping that 6 losses, but certainly not more than 7. It's going to be hard for them because with the SEC and the Big Ten in particular having so many chances for quad one wins, it's just going to be hard for them to pass those teams unless they just really get hot and go on a heater.
I would say, Dave, I do think they'd have to almost run the table here, and beat like St. Mary's 3 times or something like that. Because you look at that resume though, their 2 best wins are Baylor and San Diego State. Okay, now back 2 months ago or a month and a half ago, those are pretty good wins, right? Well, San Diego State and Baylor haven't really held up their end of the bargain here lately. So now those wins don't look nearly as good as they did a while back either. So, it's just have to wait and see what happens. But
Yeah,
that's
and we
just
got a month
one.
and a half to go. So, San
Right.
Diego State and Baylor could obviously improve their stock again, but they're probably at best middle of the bracket teams right now, and San Diego State's probably pushing toward the bubble at this point.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that certainly doesn't help Gonzaga's case either in terms of trying to maybe um, avoid getting close to that 8-9 type of scenario that they're probably at least going to be around as we record this.
I think St. Mary's is like 32 or somewhere. So if they were to knock off St. Mary's, even if they dropped to say 40, that's three top 40 wins right there. So that would be good. But anyway, BV rankings that come out every Monday. Check them out at Bracketville, and make sure you subscribe and then leave us some comments as well. We'll be happy. There's going to be some subscriber only. I can do a plug right here. Some subscriber only things that we're going to do as we move forward right now. So you want to get your subscription into Bracketville right now. You'll get updates on when things come out and so forth. Be a lot handier for it. It's kind of a one-stop shop. Dave does a great job with daily updates, like especially those late games. If you're not a night owl like me, you don't stay up all night and watch these silly games. And the next thing you know, Dave's got them all the next morning. You just pop that open and see what you missed. Because what was it? There was that late. Oh, yeah, New Mexico and Boise. That was
Yeah.
a heck of a battle. That was on Friday night. Yeah, I stayed up late and watched that one. All right. Oh, here's my favorite topic: Texas Tech. Dave's gonna chuckle because I bring them up frequently. Um, just to share with people that maybe don't know me as well as Dave does. Um, I'm an old school guy, and I sometimes I understand these wonderful new metrics, and I understand they're a big part of what we do, and they're a big part of the net. Um, I always give the example of 10 years ago. It's been 10 years, doesn't seem that long. I was at the NCAA mock selection committee. And I remember our friend Kerry Miller at one point early on in the discussion on some team brought up Ken Palm. And Dan Gavin, who runs the whole basketball operation with the selection committee and so forth, interjected, look, I understand, a lot of you guys look at Ken Palm stuff. I can tell you, we just met a week ago and the word Ken Palm never came up once. That was just 10 years ago. Now, I mean, I don't think they talk about a team when we don't hear Ken Palm or predictive metrics or so forth. So they've taken on a much greater role in the selection process. And obviously, they're a greater role in how the net rolls out as well. And Dave, you and I were talking about this the other day, just kind of describe here with Texas Tech why, because people I'm sure wonder, well, wait, until recently, this has changed a lot here in the last week. They didn't have really any wins. They beat BYU on the road and they beat Arizona at home. Before that, all they had was a road win at Utah. And you eloquently described why they're so good in the predictive metrics.
Yeah, we've seen this. It used to be years ago, back when we first got started in this, Tim, and you probably before me. Back in the old late great Big East days, right? They used to get accused of this back in the day, where they would basically play, all the Big East teams would play nobody in the non-conference, and they'd all rack up. They'd all inter-conference play 12-0, 13-0, something like that. And so in the old RPI formula that was largely based on winning percentage, every Big East team looked good throughout the season in the RPI because they all came in with these gaudy records. Well, the net has certainly improved from the old RPI, but one of the tricky parts, I suppose, and again, I always tell people I am not a math guru. I don't pretend to be. I cannot explain the nuances of all the formulas to you, but it's become clear that one of the ways to advance your net rating, and particularly the predictive metrics, is to win by significant margins or win above the margins that you're anticipated to win. whether that team is very good or they're not. So hence, when you see a score like this on Lamar of 101-57, that's going to look good to your predictive metrics and probably benefit your net rating more so than maybe it should. What I would say, the other thing about Texas Tech over the years, and why some years they have been a bubble team, particularly this time of year a lot, is because they just have not always scheduled very strong. I mean, if you look at this team sheet that you have up here right now, they have 2 non-conference games that are in quads 1 and 2. The rest are in 3 and 4. And now some of that's not all there. Nobody maybe figured Syracuse was going to be quite, as down as they are. And St. Joseph's at one point this year was thought maybe to be the best team in the A10. So some of those things happen. And then that shows up in their non-conference strength of schedule, which is 316, which I pointed that out today. Texas Tech doesn't want to be one of those teams that ends up on the bubble in March when you're presenting to the committee that you got a non-conference strength of schedule over 300. So that win over Arizona this past weekend was really big for them, not just because it's a quad 1A win, but if we're realistic right now, despite BYU's 46th rating, they're not particularly close to being in the field at the moment.
Right.
And neither is Utah. So as we sit here today, having lost to UCF at home, now granted that I do give them some kudos for only losing by a point to Iowa State. I mean, that was a heck of a basketball game. That win over Arizona is big. And then when you add in, like you mentioned, trying to balance and improve their results-based metrics enough, you're trying to balance that with the predictives. And that probably jumped them up just above the immediate bubble for me. But I could see an argument that they're still right along that line, depending on how you want to break it down.
Yeah, and I would say this. That used to be the big red flag if you saw 300 in non-conference strength of schedule. Because like you even said, they played St. Joe's. I get that, they were one of the favorites in the A10, but other than that, they played A&M, okay. But other than that, they didn't try. I mean, they just flat out didn't try. Come on. Anybody going into this year would know that, hey, Syracuse isn't going to be one of the top teams in the country. Obviously, DePaul's not. Now, Northern Colorado's a good Big Sky team, but that schedule's really weak. I mean, and normally the committee for years really hammered teams with that non-conference strength of schedule. I think first team pops into my mind was the old Seth Greenberg teams at Virginia Tech, who would all get on their soapbox and say, "Yeah, but we beat Duke," and the committee would say, "Yeah, but you played no one." They come in with a 23-9 record, and they'd say, "You played no one in the non-conference."
Well, and that's where we've had this.
Yeah, they played imbalanced.
Tim.
They played imbalanced conference schedule, so it was even worse.
And we've had this discussion on our mock committees before.
Yeah.
Where, like, for example, if you look at this, if you do what I like to call, and I mentioned this in a post the other day, once we get to February, it's time to start bringing up the effective record of teams. If you go and just throw out, for the purposes of the podcast today, 200 plus home games that are basically bye games, right? That takes 5 games by quick count. So if you pull those out, if you pull out those 5 wins from Texas Tech, that basically leaves them, 8 and 4. So, that's one of those things later. That's the other reason. And Texas Tech's not the only one. We're kind of highlighting them here. But, Maryland's got that issue.
Right.
Their non-conference is 329, Vanderbilt 331. So those are another couple of teams, SEC, Big Ten, who are going to probably have to. I know Vanderbilt just had a big win at home this past weekend, but they're going to have to sustain some excellence and get some key wins between now and stretch, because they don't want to be one of those teams that comes, hovering in one of those last 4 or 5 teams in if they're being put in a group. And they say, well, gee, you had 8 wins against teams ranked 220 or higher in the net in the non-conference. That could get them into some trouble later on.
Right. And two points. One, anyway, back in the day, like I want to say like the last, I guess the last committee last year, Iowa State was one that had a terrible non-conference schedule, and the committee didn't seem to like in the old days. They used to, they would they would drop a team a seed line because of that, of where you think they should have been. You know, saying, hey, look, you had a great season, but you did not challenge yourself in the non-conference like these other teams around you did. Um, they didn't do that last year, and I know I talked to a couple coaches from some different schools, and I remember they were really hot about that. They said, you know what, we're not going to play anybody next year. Well, when I looked at their schedule, they did play somebody, so that went out the window. That being said, the other thing is, yeah, you look at 3-0 road record, yeah, but the three teams are BYU, Utah, and Kansas State, not going to get in the tournament more than likely. And you mentioned Vanderbilt, who we're going to talk about next, but I with them, I would say it's a little different because as you see here with Texas Tech in the Big 12, you've got BYU, Utah, Kansas State, Arizona State. There's plenty of teams below their level that they still have to play, right? With Vanderbilt, what is there? South Carolina? you know, I mean, every other team they play, any kind of a win is a big boost to them. So if they just waddle through at 500, they're going to have a ton of big wins.
Yeah, and the real question will be with Vanderbilt too. Yeah, they're going to have. I mean, if you end up 500 in the SEC this year, you're probably getting a bid. I would have a hard time believing that wouldn't happen, unless somehow you manage with your rotation to beat every. You got to play the teams you played twice were all below you, and I had a question earlier, and you may have had it too. Do I think the SEC is going to break the all-time record and get 12 teams in?
Better look like it right
As
now.
we sit here today, I think they've got a chance. I still would say I think that probably, I feel pretty good that probably at least 10 is going to happen.
Yes.
I could see 11. It starts getting a little more unclear when you start getting to 12 or 13, just because strange things can happen at the end of the year. And no better example of that than 2024 championship week of last year when we lost 5 spots. So, I mean, are the teams good enough? But we're also going to have to see how they continue to beat each other up, because there's going to be a loser every single night. And are some of the teams going to be able to survive? And that's where I think a team like Vanderbilt could find it more difficult later on if they don't win enough up games, because that non-conference schedule is not going to help them out. They're not going to be able to be buoyed up by, some other non-conference wins that they got.
Yeah, and we had 13, but that was including Texas and Arkansas. And Texas every day gets further away from the field, and so does Arkansas.
Arkansas certainly doesn't look like a tournament team.
Right.
I don't think LSU's in that discussion.
Yeah, LSU would be the other. That was the other team I was trying to think of besides
And South Carolina. So, you got 4 right there, and then you got Vanderbilt's, kind of right there, and then we'll see how if Missouri and Georgia.
Yeah, Missouri seems to be holding up fine.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing too. Texas is, I think, 40 in the net. I mean, so even when they're playing a team that's not in the field in the SEC, it's a quality win if they win.
Well, the good news for them is there's truly not going to be anything such as a bad loss in the SEC.
Yeah.
You could end up with too many losses easily, but you're not going to have any bad ones in the conference.
Right. All right. And by the way, I apologize. I know you people are going to say, wow, that guy sounds terrible. I actually feel great compared to how I felt the last 3 days. So I'm thankful I'm feeling a little better today. Um, yeah, we've talked about Vanderbilt. We next want to jump into talking about some bubble teams, and Vanderbilt was one of them. I think we've spent a fair amount of time on them. So I want to talk about just maybe they're not necessarily smack dab on the bubble right now, but they're teams that I kind of think are moving that way. Here's a team that I've had probably off the bubble more than most this year. Um, I know Dave has had them squarely on the bubble, and that's St. Mary's. The interesting thing about St. Mary's is, they've dug into conference play, and they haven't played any of the top teams yet. I mean, they're 5 games in, 6 games in, and they haven't played anybody. I mean, they haven't played Washington State, Oregon State, Gonzaga, San Francisco. That's kind of unusual. Uh, I would I would say to not be too provincial and homer here, but there was another team in the Big East that was that way, was UConn. They hadn't played any of the top teams, and look what happened when they played one. So it'll be interesting to see this team when they play those teams. Now, if they can go, I think they're still playing a round robin, aren't they, in the WCC?
I'd have to look at the schedule. I'm so used to thinking people don't play round robins anymore within the big conferences. So, I'll add a couple thoughts here while you look that
I'll
up,
look it
Tim.
up.
For me, there's a couple of reasons I've been a little bit hesitant to move St. Mary's up off of what you would consider bubble territory. They've been hovering. Now, they're in my field as we sit here today because they're the AQ um,
Right.
for the West Coast Conference at 6-0. But I look through here, and one of the things, now you give them credit. They for them they played a pretty aggressive non-conference schedule. It's not as easy for St. Mary's to go out and load up on power conference teams. Um, so overall, I think they did a lot of things well, and I think they're in good position to ultimately claim a bid. But I'm one of those that maybe looks, we all have our nuances, and that's why when we do our mock committee and the real committee works as a team, is that it's not just one person's opinion, it's a collective work from the group. So for me, I look at this and I say, okay, they do have 2 quad 1 wins. Nebraska right now is probably on the right side of the bubble. Utah, as we discussed, probably is not. Arizona State's probably not. And then USC, at least right now, has a lot of talent, but probably is not in anyone's field as an at-large team right now either. So basically, they have 1 win against a bubble team on a neutral court. And for me, that kind of leaves you in bubble status, at least for now, particularly when I look at some of the other bubble teams around from the SEC and Big Ten who every night have a chance to get a quad 1A win. It's a little bit of a wait and see. So I'm not really down on St. Mary's. I just don't see enough here right now to say, hey, your profile, even though you might have a quad 1 win at Utah, is necessarily significantly better than a bunch of other bubble teams. And so that's kind of why they're right on that cut line for me.
Yeah, just a point. So there are 11 teams in WCC. I know there's 11 in the Big East, and they do play round robin. They play 20 conference games. They're only going to play 18 in the WCC, so they're going to skip. They're going to have 1 game against a few teams. But we just said they're 6-0 and haven't played anybody. Listen to their next run of games: San Francisco at Washington State, at Santa Clara, Gonzaga at San Francisco, at Oregon State, Santa Clara, Washington State. We're going to find out a lot about the Gales here in the next 10 games.
Yep. I mean,
Um,
they could be sort of comfortably in, or they could be uncomfortably out.
yeah. And I will say this in their defense: they are 15-3. Okay. They've tipped it 18 times and won 15 of them. They played a pretty decent non-conference schedule. As we know, St. Mary's over the years didn't even like to leave California. They've actually gone out and played some people. Um, and really their result base for as weak as their schedule is not that bad considering. I mean, 44 is probably not bad considering you've beaten one bubblish team and that team is headed in the wrong direction right now. And their computer metrics are pretty decent because obviously once again, when you beat somebody 103 to 56, you're going to gain offensive and defensive efficiency numbers in the net. So, um, when you look at their computer numbers, you could see them saying, they're 10. I think I have them. I haven't finished my bracket, which will, by the way, we'll both post brackets tomorrow. But last Friday at bracket, I had them. They were in my last four buys. So, I think the bubble kind of stayed where it was. They're gonna be the AQ tomorrow, so they don't have any problem with that being in the field.
Right.
Another team, two teams that I kind of always lump together. I guess maybe because they're blue bloods, and that's North Carolina and Indiana. Now they're kind of in different spots, but I do think Indiana or North Carolina's resume is fascinating to me. Um, Maybe you can help me out, David. Was it was it Oklahoma last year who had a resume that looked kind of like this, where weren't they like 1-12 in Q1A or something like that? Or it
Yeah, I
was
don't
somebody
remember. I'd have to
it
go
was
back
somebody
and
in the
look.
Big 12. It was one of those Big 12 teams. Um, they play teams tough. They obviously played a wicked schedule. Now, when you look at North Carolina, first thing jumps out at you that almost all except one were non-conference games. So probably Hubert probably overscheduled a little bit here is what the first thing I'd say. Um, but they really don't have a lot, even though they've played much better lately. They have that UCLA win, which isn't all that great right now. And then over the weekend to throw up again, a team that's only 78 in the net, Stanford, so they're still a decent net team, but it does fall into quad three because it was a home game.
Yeah.
You start looking
Well,
at that, you're like, they've lost 7 times.
yeah.
It's not looking good.
This team right now, what you're looking at right here, if you haven't looked at these team sheets before, is like the quintessential example of a power conference bubble team.
Yes.
Because if you take the name off of that and you don't look at that as North Carolina, you probably think, well, yeah, I don't know that they've done enough. Because
Put
again, if
St.
we
Joe's
look at
put
that
St.
today,
Joe's name on there. Put
yeah, I
St.
mean,
Joe's name on there. You
yeah,
would never have them in the field.
SMU is an intriguing case. They've got a big game coming up. They got blown out by Duke at home. And as we record this, somebody may watch it after, but they get Louisville at home this week, um, tomorrow night. So
Huge game.
if that's going to be another big chance for them. Um, I think again their net is a 35, so it looks good. But right now, UCLA would be the only team that North Carolina has beaten that's in the field.
Right. SMU's close.
SMU's close. They're probably right, either first four out or next
Yeah.
four out, somewhere in
I
that,
I look at them every week thinking they're going to get in and
somewhere
they
in
just
there.
always miss out.
Now, the other thing, it is fair to say that all of North Carolina's losses, but the one to Stanford, are in the upper tier of quad one. So I think that has helped them up until that Stanford loss, kind of give them a little bit of grace, a little bit of a runway.
Yep.
But with that loss, particularly knowing that really outside of Duke, there's not a high end up game in the ACC. Now,
Yeah.
Louisville is ahead of schedule, and Pat Kelsey has done an incredible job with that team, um, and certainly look like they're on their way to making the tournament. And then you have sort of Pitt and Clemson that are sort of in the middle
Yeah,
in
I'd
there
say
somewhere.
I'd
I
say
think
Clemson
Clemson's
won't be a
probably a
bad
little
game for them.
little
Yeah.
ahead of Pitt right now. Pitt's on a
Yeah.
bit of a skid, but we don't have the high end up games, right? So they don't have the typical Virginia that we've had in the past and the typical Wake that maybe we thought we were going to get. So I guess where I'm going with this is there's a lot of quad two and maybe some a lot of quad three games left in the ACC. So if Carolina doesn't at least split with Duke, because they've already lost to Louisville, and I think they only play once. So yeah, it's just going to be hard for them to move that needle. So they're going to have to do it by volume, which means they can't afford many more
Stanford's.
Yeah, I mean they can't. They're just going to have to win a lot of their games coming in and get up to 25-9 or something like that. When they get to the end of the season. And of course, all this is predicated on what else the bubble looks like. The bubble is full of weak-looking teams, so you just have to be the least weak of a group, I guess, is one way to look at that.
Yeah, they've got Wake. North Carolina's Wake on the 21st, then Boston College, then at Pitt, at Duke, and then Pittsburgh at home, and then at Clemson.
So that stretch right there is probably going to
That's going to
make or
decide it.
break them.
Yep. If they can go 3-1 there, they're going to be okay.
Yeah. They would have to really fall off the table then.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. They don't play anybody else except Duke after that. And they're hurt kind of by Miami not being very good this year in that conference.
Yeah.
That hurt. Yeah. And then the other team that just, you talk about their resume and that's the way it looks for a big college team. Then you go down and look at Indiana's. Kind of similar, except they're a little heavier on the back end. But Indiana's a team that's just every time you start to think and kind of believe in them, they don't get it done. So they're 14-5. It's a good record. Computers don't like them very well, though. That's a big problem there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do, Tim, is the fact that some of those non-conference games, they just, this sounds really trivial to say, but, like for example, if you look at that quadrant 3 game against Chattanooga, where that game was really close down to the last couple of minutes, and then they ended up winning by 9, right? And the Winthrop game winning by by less than 10. It's not like they're 1 points, but if the computers expect you to win that game by 15 or 18 points and you win it by 7 or 8, you're actually going to lose ground even though you won the game.
Oh, I wouldn't. That's not being trivial at all. That's exactly why their computer numbers aren't good. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, they actually, if I'm looking at this from a scheduling perspective, they actually did a pretty good job of scheduling. Only had 4 quad 4 games. They had some quad 3 games that were winnable, which they took care of business. They only had 3 high tier non-conference games, which kind of hurt them. I'll give them credit for this. They've taken care of some of those lower ranked teams in the Big Ten, Minnesota, Rutgers, USC, who some other teams we've just seen. Nebraska lost to Rutgers, Michigan lost to Minnesota, Iowa lost to USC. So they've at least taken care of those games. But they've got to, and really they've only played, if you look at that, they've really only played Illinois of the big dogs in the Big Ten. So they've got a lot of chances left here.
Yeah. And that's going to be, that's the thing. There's a lot to be decided. When I look at them, I go back and think, okay, well, preseason, we all thought Indiana was probably going to be a top 20 team, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Top 25 for sure. And what's hurt them too with those predictives is that it seemed when they've had off games, it's gone south in a hurry. When they played Louisville early on out there in the Bahamas, and Louisville just jumped all over them, and coasted to a near 30-point win. The other night when Illinois came into Bloomington, they got off to a hot start, and Indiana gave up, I think it was 50 or 60 points in the first half or something, and never got back in the game. And then the same sort of thing with Gonzaga out in the Bahamas. So they lost big at Iowa. They lost fairly big at Nebraska. Those are the kind of things that hurt those predictive metrics. You don't win by a whole lot, but when you lose big. So I think that's why you have that disparity between their results-based metrics that would suggest they're probably on the right side of the bubble. Their net and their predictive metrics say it's a lot more questionable. And so they're sort of another one of those quintessential bubble teams right now. What I would point out, too, that we talked about earlier is they do have a couple of road wins, which is nice because road wins are never easy to get in conference. So they get kudos for that, which to me gives them a bit of a jump over a team like Maryland if you're comparing the two side by side right now. But if Ohio State doesn't turn around and make the field, I'm not sure Penn State's going to have enough to do that and overcome a 300-plus non-conference schedule.
Right.
To your point, Tim, with the big dogs coming up, Indiana has yet to beat a team that, as we sit here today recording this, would probably be in the field.
Yeah, they're going to have tons of chances. Michigan, Michigan State, Purdue, Oregon. They haven't made that trip yet. UCLA, they got tons of chances. So, and I would point out, I said to somebody this weekend, that win over Ohio State on the road, you might look back on Selection Sunday and say that's what got them in over Ohio State, I mean, it might be. It might be that close.
Yep. I mean, this is what's weird about if you're a fan right now, once you beat a team, now you want Ohio State to go out and win some games.
Right.
You don't want them to end up putting them in a slide and they slide down to 50 something and then they end up being a lower end quad one. And yeah, it's kind of funny that way.
We saw a lot of movement. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Dave, because I know in my bracket that I'm going to put out tomorrow, I'm just doing through probably the 6, 7 seeds right now to the top. But there's some teams that maybe lost and actually moved up a slot. Teams that won and actually dropped a couple of slots, a couple of lines on the seed list. The reason that happens is we're not just throwing darts here. A lot of times, the teams that they have beat and or lost to, their resumes change. And it may go from a 2B win to a 1B win. It may, it can happen in a week's time right now when the volume of a game stills down a little bit. So you've kind of got to take that all into consideration. So it's not a poll, as Dave has said many times. It's not a poll. This isn't, bracketology is not a poll. The seed lists aren't a poll. It's not, oh, well, Michigan lost, so we're going to drop them a couple slots or what have you. It's you still got to look at each team every week. And I think it's always the challenge of us bracketologists, right? It's easy just to go, oh, Tennessee lost, let's drop them one, when maybe you look at it and go, no, you know what? They shouldn't have dropped. Now they might have, but I'm just giving them as an example.
I mean, if you think about it, if you're playing a high quality team that's maybe ranked above you on the road, you're probably supposed to lose that game. So if you make it competitive and lose a close game, the polls are going to drop you just because you lost. That's not necessarily what the committee would do.
Right.
Again, but every result, particularly because we're still sort of I don't want to say we're past the mid-season, but we're still young enough where one or two results can have a larger impact on how the overall resume looks. By the time we get another month of play in and we get towards the end of February, unless you're truly one of the bubble teams, one of those last 8, 10 teams in or first 6, 7 teams out, one result probably isn't, unless it's really great, like you went and beat the top team in your conference on the road, or you lost to the bottom dweller, probably isn't going to have one game, is not going to have a huge impact after you already have 25, 26 games in the books.
Yeah, and to your point, Dave, here's a perfect example on this team sheet with Indiana. We get so caught up in the quads, right? And oh, well, they've got, one quad win and quad two. USC sitting at 76. Tomorrow they could be at 75. Oh, guess what? It's a quad two
Yeah.
win,
Yeah.
you know? And that's why you can't, when you're analyzing teams, you have to look for stuff like that because you can't just go, oh, they have two quad two wins. Well, if their quad two wins are against 75 and 74, they're almost quad threes, at their home win. So you kind
Well,
of
and
got to
kind
take
of
that
one
all
final
into.
point here, Tim, this would show up depending on whom you put them against. When you really start delving into the meat of this, particularly as we get closer, to March, the one thing about Indiana's schedule here that you mentioned, playing teams like South Carolina, UNCG, and I realize that was part of a challenge, I think, Miami and Chattanooga, as opposed to teams that are 250, 300 plus, is that if they end up staying in quad three, it looks much better to have a comparative record of, say, over 500 against the top three quadrants than it does to have a losing record against the top three quadrants. Even if, because what happens to some teams is they end up with a lot of games in one in the top of two, but they don't win very many. And then the rest of their games, a lot of them are in quad four, and they end up with like a 3, 4, 5 game, maybe they only end up 4 games over 500, but they have a losing record to the top three quads. So depending on who those wins are against and where, that makes it a little more difficult when the committee's kind of grinding through their team sheet.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're getting down to the end. Did you just got anything else you want to bring up? Anything that jumps out at you this week?
No, I just thought maybe just real quick, I did a little rundown over the weekend on, some number one seed contenders, and how deep, and it'll be interesting to see. I mean, obviously, most of us, if you start going down to the top 7 or 8 teams, I mean, you've got Auburn and Duke and Iowa State and Alabama and Tennessee and Kentucky and Florida are probably all going to still be considered number one seed candidates right now, depending on how the rest of the SEC plays out. And then I think, you've got some teams on the periphery that could still get back up there potentially. I think at Kansas with their non-conference wins, if they go on a heater in the Big 12, I don't think you could eliminate them from that conversation because, again, teams are going to beat each other up in the SEC. I think a team like Purdue, with what they did, could still get back into that number one seed conversation, so they're on the list. Certainly, I wouldn't have them there right now, but if Michigan State, keeps winning and going through the Big Ten and only ends up with 4, 5, 6 losses, they could be in that conversation as well. I'm not sure Oregon, as much success as they've had in quad one and two, I'm not sure their predictive metrics are going to
Right,
give them a chance to get to that top line unless
right.
they start winning by wide margins down the stretch. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts. There could be another team or two emerge. I suppose Houston could really run the table in the Big 12
Yeah,
and
I
get
was, I
back
was
in
just
that
going to bring them up.
conversation.
Like,
But right
I,
now,
I,
Houston's down along, they moved up to the 4 line for me this week simply because they're the Big 12 leader.
yeah, I'm in the four line as well.
But they've got some work to do if they're going to get back in that number one seed conversation because they're going to have a lot of SEC teams to pass to get there.
And again, there's a perfect example of a team that hasn't played any of the big dogs in the Big 12 yet.
Yep.
When they do, and if they beat them, if they beat Iowa State and Kansas, hey, they're gonna be moving on up. I find this a fascinating resume because it's usually Houston. You didn't have to worry too much about who they played because they played in the Big 12, but their predictive metrics are crazy. I
Yep.
mean, 1, 2, and 3. I mean, an
Yeah.
average of two. That's unbelievable
Yeah.
for a team. They're number three net, yet they're a team that you look and they haven't. They beat a very good West Virginia team that looks better and better every day. They did go on the road and they just eked out. Man, if they lost that game, I'd have had a lot of questions about this team. They easily could have lost that
Yeah.
UCF game. They were
Well,
down.
they lost it and then they won it all in the
Yeah,
last 5
exactly.
seconds.
But you see the rest of they haven't played anybody in the Big 12, BYU, TCU, Oklahoma State, and Kansas State. So
Iowa
they've got
State.
a lot of high quality games coming here.
Yep. I one thing sort of on a closing note. I mean, Auburn has put themselves in a position where they could lose 2 or 3 times and not probably blink an eye at a number 1 seed at this point.
Gotcha.
And then sort of the other thing I would say, just from an odds standpoint, Duke is in a prime position to claim a number 1 seed, most likely in the East, simply because, yeah, I think I looked it up at Bart Torvik's site the other day. I think they're favored to win every single remaining game, and their lowest percentage is when they play Illinois I think it's maybe at Madison Square Garden in late February. They have like a 65% chance to win that game.
Oh, that's a big game for Illinois.
But so my point is, even though the ACC isn't top loaded by any stretch of the imagination, Duke has a couple of big wins from the non-conference, and their metrics are off the charts. And there's nothing in the ACC that's probably going to slow that down. And if Duke goes in, wins the ACC tournament, or goes into the ACC tournament like 32-3, it's probably going to be very hard to see the committee not putting Duke on the 1 line.
Oh, absolutely. I got to be careful because I know me and Dave are kind of alike. We could sit here for 8 hours and talk about it. We don't want to make this too long, but I want to spend one more minute on a team I have been different on than most people in the country. I've had them lower than most people. Now I'm going to have them a 2 seed this week. And that's Florida. And I guess here I'll just say what my issues are with them. Obviously, I don't have. They're 16-2. All right, so let's be real here. But to make them a number 1, yeah, they hammered Tennessee. I get that. But I mean, they haven't beat another. I mean, if you want to call North Carolina a quality team, okay. But that's it. That's the only team they beat that's in the field.
Yeah, and I agree, Tim. I think I've got them high. They were hovering around the 3 for me for a while, 3 to 4. I have bumped them up. I mean, they looked really good in that loss, Kentucky. I mean, I realize it's a loss, but you put up 100 points at Rupp Arena against a pretty good Kentucky team, and then you thump Tennessee. I think we're all surprised, maybe more kudos to Missouri for going in there to win after that. But to your point, they've got a lot of high-level SEC games to come. So that means Florida could end up being in the number 1 seed conversation. They could also end up being in the 4 or 5 seed conversation, depending on the results of how those games play out.
Right. And again, here's another case, non-conference, 233. So again, the non-conference games they played, their toughest one was North Carolina.
You pair that to like a team like Alabama.
Yeah.
Who went out and played everybody. That, fair or unfair, the committee has historically rewarded teams like Alabama for going out and challenging. So Alabama could lose a couple of more games, and like they are right now, and still be, quote, ahead of Florida if you're looking at their overall resume by what they've accomplished.
Yeah, I just can't. I think I have them 7th overall this week. I just can't push them past a couple teams when I compare resumes.
Yeah, and we won't do it now, but one of these podcasts we need to take through how the committee is going to have fun breaking all their own rules with all of their exceptions potentially this year with the SEC, with the odds, I would say, in favor of having more than 5 teams in the top 16 of the seed line come Selection Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, they just got to smash them all together. That's all they can do. Which I personally, I think we've talked about this, but bracketing actually has been easier this year because most of these conferences only play each other once, so it's a little bit simpler. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Hope you enjoyed it. Give us your thoughts, and make sure to hit Bracketville tomorrow, Tuesday, the 21st. We will have our brackets up, our brand new brackets up tomorrow. And then each day go there for updates on the games from the previous day. A look ahead. Dave does a great job with the look ahead for the week of the upcoming key games. And then we will go on there. We'll randomly put some thoughts on just about bracketing, just about teams we've seen, and so forth. So check it all out. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. We'll see you folks later.